Wallace Stegner was a novelist and teacher who was deeply rooted in the Western landscape. I first met him in 1984. He was in his 70s and just beginning work on one of his finest novels. Raised in the West, it was his love of wild places that made him outspoken about the environment. He once wrote,
I hope I learned something from knowing intimately the creatures of the earth. I hope I learned something from looking a long way, from looking up, from being much alone.
His Western upbringing also kept him hopeful and gave him a deep understanding of the American character. I'm Robert Redford, inviting you to join me now for a look at one of the great writers of our time.
Major funding for Wallace Stegner, A Writer's Life, was provided by... Additional funding was provided by... and by... and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
Wallace Stegner's home is hidden in the countryside, surrounded by oak trees and less than an hour's drive from San Francisco. This is where he spent most of his writing career with his wife, Mary. Even in his 80s, Stegner was active, gardening, writing, and lecturing. He took part in this program during the last 4 years of his life. It was an opportunity to look back on his 50-year career. His fiction received the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. His books reveal an unending quest to understand and define the American experience. The place of his beginning was so remote that it sometimes seemed like a dream. Stegner was raised in the northern Great Plains.
I think maybe 2 or 3 kinds of experiences made a profound impression on me when I was 5 or 6 years old. One of them was sleeping under a wagon and feeling that wind come across the grassland for hundreds of miles. The bigness of night outside and the bigness of stars and the littleness of us in our absolutely unsheltered condition, nothing but a wagon to sleep under. The universe doesn't have any obligation to you, whatever you would like to think about it. And it's probably useful to learn that early. And I don't think you do learn it in a place which is crowded with people. I think you learn that kind of thing in a place where you're all alone and a little scared, a little bit timid in the face of the universe.
Stegner was born in 1909. The oldest family photos show his older brother Cecil and young Wallace. Their world was shaped profoundly by the few family members around them. Each day of their lives was poised between a harsh and dominating father and a mother ready to protect them. In 1914, the Stegner family took up homesteading in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan. For the father, George Stegner, it was a chance to get rich quick. But for young Wallace, it was a time marred by humiliation.
He was a very impatient man. And I was a kind of sickly kid, and my hands were always frozen, and my nose was always running, and so on. And I suspect I was a disgusting spectacle to him.
Stegner always carried childhood wounds inflicted by his headstrong father. Never at ease with the unpleasant sights of farm life, young Stegner was sickened at the sight of old sows being shot and butchered, only to hear the taunts of his father calling him sissy. Smiling and singing folk tunes one minute, exploding into unchecked anger the next, his father engendered a deep resentment in Wallace. George Stegner's plans for quick riches met with continual failure, and the family was forced to move on. They took to the roads, joining the earliest waves of Dust Bowl refugees, who by the 1930s would number in the millions. For all of them, it was an unending search for a better place. Wallace Stegner would always be a seeker.
He had a notion where home would turn out to be, for himself as for his father. Over the next range, on the big rock, Candy Mountain, that place of impossible loveliness that had pulled the whole nation westward, the place where the fat land sweated up wealth and the heavens dropped lemonade. On the big rock, Candy Mountain, where the cops have wooden legs and the handouts grow on bushes and the hens lay soft-boiled eggs. I'm gonna go where there ain't no snow, where the rain don't fall and the wind don't blow, on the big rock, Candy Mountain.
The Stegner family migrated to Salt Lake City in 1921. Wallace was 12 years old. His father found it difficult to establish roots, and the family moved from house to house while he tried everything from gambling to bootlegging. For young Wallace, the city opened windows on a larger world he had never dreamed of. He and his family didn't belong to the prevailing Mormon faith, but the city and its people welcomed and embraced him.
It was a lovely place to live when I lived there. I suffered one of those expansions that you do in any life. There are times when you grow more than you do other times, and that was one of the places where I grew. It was the first place where I'd lived where I felt fully secure, because we'd been very migratory up to that point. And at that point, I began to dig myself in and make friends in high school and college.
In 1925, Stegner enrolled at the University of Utah. Tennis quickly became a favorite pastime, with books and classes taking a back seat. A teenage growth spurt added 6 inches to his height. One of his tennis partners was David Freed.
A fellow named Harry Gus was playing in the finals of the university championships against Wally, and it was a long 5-set match. Well, at the end of the 3rd set, there was a 15-minute intermission, and Harry was very impressed because he went in the locker room, took a shower, got all refreshed, while Wally sat under a tree and read a book.
Stegner himself attached little importance to his college literary efforts. His family gave him no direction.
I never did have any youthful ambitions. I didn't have any notion of aim, because I had no notion of how to aim, what direction to aim in.
But it was on family trips to southern Utah that Wallace Stegner found something that claimed his devotion. The vast Colorado Plateau, a geography that would weave itself into his life.
I like the smells of it. I like the look of it. I like the mystery and space of it. I like the silence of it at night.
Wallace graduated in Salt Lake City. The family had seen the loss of his brother Cecil to illness. In 1933, his father had deserted the family, leaving Wallace to care for his dying mother. Despite the family's migratory existence, Hilda Stegner had brought kindness and laughter to her children. He was forever grateful.
I think that our relations with women from the very beginning are more intimate than our relations with men. It's women who teach us affection, who teach us practically everything.
Stegner later acknowledged how much of his mother's nesting instinct he inherited. Soon after her death, he was seeking for himself the stability she represented. His prospects looked promising when he met Mary Page at the University of Iowa, where he was completing his graduate degree.
I was only 23. I wasn't thinking about what it was going to be like to marry anybody or ever even thought of marrying him.
She was going to be in the book business, and I persuaded her otherwise.
Right from the very beginning, I was impressed with his writing.
I was a barbarian, you know, a complete barbarian, and if any of that's been rubbed off, she rubbed it off. She had a lot of the kinds of stable community life and so on, which I had always coveted, but had never really had.
In 1934, Stegner returned with his new wife to the University of Utah as an instructor. In his spare time, he wrote several short stories based on his childhood. To his delight, they were published. He then entered a short story contest and took first place in a cash prize. The story, Remembering Laughter, was published in several editions. His triumph called for a party, but before the evening was over, Mary went into labor. Their only child, Paige, was born in 1937. Their 50-year marriage was off and running.
Mary's role has been indispensable because she's a very good critic. She's completely unkind to me. They used to say the best critic for your work would be your divorced wife, because she's not going to baby you. Mary doesn't baby me. And if something is not right, she tells me so. She's a very good companion. She likewise has maybe more of a sense of purpose for me than I have for myself.
Stegner and his family moved from Utah to Madison, Wisconsin, where he taught at the university while writing several short novels. Stegner drew on his own experience for his material, but these early stories were simply warm-up exercises for a far larger project. It was a massive novel recounting the world he had witnessed as a child, the frontier experience, and the search for a big rock candy mountain.
It's really, I think, the aptest title I ever gave a book. It's like the Celtic Isle of Glass. It's the other world. It's heaven. Heaven on earth, in this case.
The novel brings to life one of the great folk wanderings of the 20th century. Lured by promises of wealth from the land, millions of Americans found themselves fighting weather, geography, and the banks. Stegner focuses on Bo Mason's family, a family much like his own.
Big Rock Candy Mountain is a book about motion. It's got some places, but they're just stopping places. In most cases, it's just been hit and run. It's been boom and bust, invasion and departure.
Bo Mason, the father in the novel, leads his family across the West. Without fail, his money-making schemes come to nothing. Along with so many other Americans, he refuses to let go of his dreams.
There was somewhere, if you knew where to find it, some place where money could be made like drawing water from a well. Some big rock candy mountain where life was effortless and rich and unrestricted and full of adventure and action, where something could be had for nothing. You stood on your own 2 feet and to hell with the rest of the world.
As the nation rolled on towards the Great Depression, Bo Mason's determination only increased. In the early 30s, with the Depression at its worst, banks closed, businesses failed, and financial chaos gripped the lives of millions. Bo Mason's single-minded energy saves his own family, but for countless Americans, the dream was fading. The novel depicts Bo Mason's son driving across America, reflecting on the broken lives around him.
"Oh, lovely America," he said, "you pulled the old trick on us again. You looked like the Queen of Fairy, and your hair smelled of wind and grass and space, and your eyes were wild. Oh, beautiful," he said, "for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties, and penury and pain."
Stegner continued to work on the Big Rock Candy Mountain for several years. He was in his early 30s, teaching in the East, his father still in Salt Lake City. It was clear to Stegner that the fictional father he was sketching was both an American type and a ghost image of his real father.
I was writing it out of my emotions. It got painful at times, but I had it on my mind a long time before I wrote it, and I suppose I just had to write my father out of my bones, you know, and get rid of him.
One scene takes place in Bo Mason's hotel room. His son, distraught by years of humiliation, is awaiting his father's return, thinking of revenge.
If he could have done it in a rage, it would be done now. But the minute he started thinking about it, it was impossible. He was still cleaning the dresser drawers when he heard the front door open. In the flash of returning rage, he wished for the gun. He saw his father in the red haze framed by the door, and he saw himself shooting him down, felt the hard, jumping kick of the gun in his wrist, saw the heavy, black-hatted figure stagger and slump, one hand hanging to the jamb.
Despite 3 years of work on the novel, Stegner was still uncertain of its ending.
I just kind of went along until it came to its natural end. It found its own ending.
The ending was provided by events in Salt Lake City. The news arrived abruptly. In a jealous rage, George Stegner shot a woman companion in the back and then turned the gun on himself. Wallace returned to Salt Lake City to bury the last member of his family. Now he could finish writing The Big Rock Candy Mountain.
I was getting rid of him, and I think I shook off quite a lot just by writing that book. He doesn't come back to haunt me the way he used to.
The book was published in numerous editions. It was praised by reviewers for its portrayal of Americans caught in the grip of an impossible dream. Stegner was featured on the cover of the Saturday Review, confirming his status as a writer of national importance. He was invited to teach at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference in Vermont, America's oldest summer writing program. One of his closest associates was poet Robert Frost, like Stegner, fascinated with the lives of ordinary Americans. His rise to prominence culminated with a job offer, teaching at Harvard University. He and Mary bought a farm in Vermont and were settling in when world tensions erupted. The Second World War found Stegner at the upper limit of draft age. He remained for a time at Harvard, but he would soon be covering another war, a domestic war. Images of rioting and the denial of civil liberties fill the newsreels. In Detroit, 33 dead, 600 injured. Look magazine asked him to write a series of articles about America's race wars.
I said, why me? You know, I didn't know very many blacks. I had grown up with a few Japanese friends. I hardly knew any Mexicans or Hispanics. Though there were plenty of them around where I had lived, I just hadn't known them because we somehow lived in different categories.
Stegner teamed up with the Look magazine photographers. They witnessed one of the tragic results of the war.
It was an infuriating, nasty kind of situation, and almost always involved with the expropriation of Japanese property. The motive was so plain and clear. This was all new to me, but it seemed so petty, unjust, ferocious in its way.
He was angry because his compassion was stirred by what he saw in the society at that time, that here we were fighting a war for democracy and fighting evil and fascism, and within our own country we were being highly prejudicial. I think injustice makes him angry.
Stegner and a Look photographer joined young Mexican Americans at Mona's malt shop. Together they went on late-night rides, ever cautious and alert.
I remember one night we were out somewhere, I don't know where, and some lights came over the hill about 2 miles away, and one of these girls said, "Lay." Law. She could recognize a cop's car that far off, so we all froze. There was no reason to examine their ID cards except that they were Mexican.
Stegner wrote about the causes and prevalence of racism in the United States. Things we have permitted here, he wrote, have a clear relationship with Nazi practices. The difference is only a difference in degree. The editors of Look distilled the intended series into a single article, taking out Stegner's most powerful words.
It scared the managers and editors of Look, so that ultimately, instead of printing a separate chapter on each of these in the magazine, they put one relatively large, innocuous melange of all the minorities together, did it in one issue and got it off quick, so that it didn't build and accumulate. I was pretty disappointed in that. I was a little angry, as a matter of fact. I understood the reasons, but I thought they were chicken.
Stegner's complete text and a collection of photos were eventually published in a hardcover edition, One Nation. Minority leaders responded enthusiastically. Walter White, executive director of the NAACP, called it a book which desperately needed to be written. Stegner's key introductory line, omitted from the pages of Look magazine, was printed in the book.
We lived in New York in a single hotel room, the only hotel room you could get in New York, for about 3 months while I wrote the book in the Look magazine office. And I remember writing that line because it was the first line that came to me, a kind of cumulative anger. There was a wall down the middle of America, a wall of suspicion, distrust, snobbery, hatred, and guilt. On one side is the majority of our people, white, Protestant, and Gentile. On the other side are people who, because of color, religion, or cultural background, are not allowed to be full citizens of the United States.
Stegner had returned to the West to carry out part of his Look magazine assignment. The region still felt like home. When Stanford University offered him a teaching position, he quickly accepted. The school provided him the opportunity to launch the first creative writing program on the West Coast. He said of his early students, "We were like a family."
They were self-starters, and they were all, at that point, not too far from my own age, so that we were like a society of friends. It wasn't quite like teacher and students.
He and Mary built a home in the foothills near Stanford. Although he took on a heavy teaching load, he continued his writing. Some of his short stories reflected the social strife of the war years and were featured in national magazines. His most consistent theme was individuals breaking out of their isolation, learning to understand others, and becoming more tolerant. In 1950, Stegner and his family embarked on a literary fact-finding tour of Asia. He was instrumental in bringing prominent Asian writers to the attention of the American public. Despite his extensive travels, an old and familiar place was luring him back. His return to the land of his childhood inspired Wolf Willow. He feared that the small towns in Saskatchewan that he had once known would not be the same, but the familiar sights were still there. In the little town of East End, he found the house his father had built. Nearby was the river he and his brother had played in as children.
The prairie was an extremely wild and beautiful place at times. It was full of wildlife, and you lived right among it. You were part of the wildlife.
In his childhood, Stegner had been acutely aware of sights and sounds close by. As an adult, it was the immensity and the geometry of the landscape which moved him.
You can see down the road until it disappears in the distance. Fences go that way, telephone poles go that way. It's all in terms of radii and diameters. And you're always at the observing center of that universe. It's very large and simple, and it can be very beautiful, and it's always kind of awesome.
He recognized this land as part of him and wrote in Wolf Willow, "I may not know who I am, but I do know where I'm from."
There was never a country that in its good moments was more beautiful. Even in drought or dust storm or blizzard, it is the reverse of monotonous once you have submitted to it with all the senses. You don't get out of the wind, but learn to lean and squint against it. You don't escape sky and sun, but wear them in your eyeballs and on your back. You become acutely aware of yourself. It is a country to breed mystical people, egocentric people, perhaps poetic people, but not humble ones.
Stegner's personal connection to the landscape was strengthened even more by his work on Beyond the 100th Meridian, a study of frontier settlement. He was becoming known as an expert on the West. In 1954, he was again featured on the cover of the Saturday Review. Most importantly, Stegner was awakening to the role his own family had played in Western history.
What it means to be Western to me is to understand that the West was a series of raids, essentially, and that most of the successful raids were made by people of power, and that there are a lot of little people who wanted to be in on those raids, who came homesteading thinking they could, on 160 acres, make a pile. I mean, that's close to my own family's experience, and that's a pretty enlightening experience. We plowed up a lot of virgin buffalo grass and got a crop or two, and then a dry year or two or three. And after a while, you just give out and blow away.
40 million acres were ruined before the government stepped in. The land still hasn't fully recovered.
What Wally believes is that much of what has happened in the West has been immoral, amoral. He insists that we not accept the myths and the romance, and he doggedly works through the actual facts of the Western experience. And what he finds is that it has largely been an experience without responsibility.
A lot of people, I think, have never found out. They think you can do anything you want with your own piece of land, and they think you can do to land in the West, which is arid and fragile, what you can do to land elsewhere, and you can't.
Almost as a penance for his family's role in ruining the land, Stegner became a defender of the public domain. He thought it was essential to have federal management of public lands.
They've never been anything but federal, and I don't think they should be anything but federal, because without the presence of the federal bureaus that do manage them, the West would be a wasteland already.
In later years, Stegner would be an outspoken critic of certain government bureaus, but his belief in federal control would never change. With the arrival of the Eisenhower administration in the early 50s, there were plans to take public lands out of federal management. Stegner was alarmed. He published his first conservation article in the Reporter magazine of 1953. He asserted that the removal of any public land from federal oversight would benefit what he termed exploiters careless of the future. The Reporter article was a new kind of writing for Stegner, partisan and passionate. He was aware of the fine line between art and propaganda.
To ask somebody, in effect, to join something, that's not the kind of novel I want to write. I have always felt somehow, and this could be wrong, that fiction was not for propaganda. I grew up in the, I mean, I became sort of aware in the 30s when everybody was writing fiction that was propagandistic in some way.
However other writers in other times may have expressed their political beliefs, Stegner resolved to write with two separate voices. One is artist, the other is activist. He used these two voices the rest of his life. In 1954, the strength of his convictions would be put to the test in a place he both knew and loved, the Colorado Plateau. The arid plateau hides life-sustaining rivers deep in its canyons. It was this water that prompted the Bureau of Reclamation to propose a huge system of dams and reservoirs. Hoover Dam, begun in 1930, was a successful and widely admired cornerstone of the Bureau's far-reaching plans. The Bureau hoped to repeat its success by the construction of several dams on the Colorado River system. Two of the proposed dams would flood Dinosaur National Monument, known as much for its fine river rafting as for its fossilized dinosaur bones. The monument is located on a remote section of the Colorado-Utah border. The river and the colorful cliffs above it would be submerged under more than 500 feet of water. Plans to dam the river moved ahead. But David Brower, director of the Sierra Club, began organizing a national campaign to stop the dams. His plan to save the monument included a book. Brower knew that no writer was better acquainted with the region than Stegner.
We needed an editor, and I didn't have to think very long to know who it should be. So I just got on the phone and said, Wally, we've got a lot of stuff for saving dinosaur. I've got these photographs, these authors, this publisher. You've got to edit it.
It was an attempt, quite self-conscious attempt, to reach members of Congress.
The book consisted of a foreword and first chapter by Stegner, essays by various experts, and dozens of photographs. Stegner was clear about the objective.
It was the issue of sticking to the letter of a law and making it a precedent for future issues. The National Park Act declares that national park areas are to be preserved and used without impairment. And if you can build dams and drown them, that impairs them somewhat.
The book was distributed to Congress. In 1955, an agreement was reached guaranteeing no dams would be built inside national parks and monuments. The campaign was successful. The book had served its purpose well.
I think it had a considerable effect in bringing the whole upper Colorado River basin project to a halt, a grinding halt.
It was the first time the modern conservation movement had forged a united front. Countless Americans would continue to enjoy this remnant of wild America. But the celebration was short-lived. Far downstream on the Colorado River was Glen Canyon. The dinosaur agreement did permit the construction of a dam here. The dam would flood the river and scenic side canyons. A small number of people knew Glen Canyon. Stegner was one of them.
He knew that country, and he also knew that far exceeding the beauty of dinosaur was what was going on in Glen Canyon downstream, and told me that that's what we should really be concentrating on.
It was the most beautiful, serene, lovely, peaceful part of the whole Colorado system. All of the side canyons, every one of them was a fun house. There's God's plenty of these things with beautiful colors, good water, lots of ferns and maidenhair.
Stegner believed the beauty of Glen Canyon was worth saving, but the conservation movement had exhausted its resources in the dinosaur battle. Construction took 6 years. The dam was designed to flood over 180 miles of the Colorado River.
The thing that the dam did to Glen Canyon was to kill off the riparian community along the shores. There is no life along the river. It killed the river.
The rising waters flooded the river's channel and side canyons, and then undercut ancient cliffs, causing massive rock slides. For Stegner, another part of the West he loved so dearly had slipped away. In 1960, he wrote a letter in defense of the nation's remaining wild areas.
Something will have gone out of us as a people if we ever let the remaining wilderness be destroyed. If we pollute the last clear air and dirty the last clean streams and push our paved roads through the last of the silence.
The Wilderness Letter was written in a single afternoon to a government commission. Stegner had no idea that this hastily composed letter would become such a lasting document.
One means of sanity is to retain a hold on the natural world, to remain, insofar as we can, good animals. Americans still have that chance, more than many people. We need wilderness preserved, as much of it as is still left, and as many kinds, because it was the challenge against which our character as a people was formed. It is good for us when we are young because of the incomparable sanity it can bring. It is important to us when we are old simply because it is there.
He concluded the letter by recalling his own childhood on a wild and lonely prairie.
I hope I learned something from knowing intimately the creatures of the earth. I hope I learned something from looking a long way, from looking up, from being much alone. We simply need that wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive to its edge and look in. For it can be a means of reassuring ourselves of our sanity as creatures, a part of the geography of hope.
The new Kennedy administration was enthusiastic about the Wilderness Letter. Stegner's optimism matched the mood of the time. Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior, Stewart Udall, invited Stegner to Washington to serve as a temporary special assistant. Stegner helped plan and launch a land acquisition program for the National Park System. But the frenetic pace of the new administration was distracting to someone whose heart was in writing, and Stegner felt it was time for a change.
I guess I was more interested in writing fiction or history or so. I really wanted to be a writer. I didn't want to be a partisan so much or a bureaucrat.
Returning home, Stegner wrote about Western history. He was becoming impatient with the cowboy myth.
There's nothing democratic about the actual history of the West. Whether the people you're talking about are miners or homesteaders or cattle people or whatever they are, there is a big money power elite which runs large numbers of essential wage slaves.
Stegner felt the cowboy myth obscured the truth of Western history. Instead of depicting people collaborating and cooperating, the myth created a false image of a self-reliant hero riding tall in the saddle.
The independent cowboy, you know, was a hired man on horseback working for $30 a month and found, and his freedom consisted of being able to quit the bad job and take one just as bad. And the people who ran him were just as much, you know, these cattle barons and so on, were as ruthless as any industrial baron you ever heard about or read about.
Even more deceptive and harmful in Stegner's view were the images of cold and violent individuals executing frontier justice on their own.
The Western independence is a kind of outlaw statement that's very attractive to a lot of people. A lot of people do feel lawless, and they would like to be lawless.
Stegner chipped away at the myth in lectures and essays.
I spend this much time on a mythic figure who has irritated me all my life because I would obviously like to bury him. But I know I can't. He's a faster gun than I am. It gets me nowhere to object to the self-righteous, limited, violent code that governs him.
Stegner's message was heard across the West and had a liberating effect on writers like William Kittredge.
One of the things Stegner did was begin to undercut that mythological story and say that's not really a true story. That's not a story that was much lived out ever anywhere, which is, of course, true. And in the models of his writing, he, in fact, began to demythologize the West and began to say that the West really is the place where we live is full of individual stories which don't correspond to that major mythological story, and that perhaps one of the things we need to do most urgently is rethink our story, begin to figure out who we are.
By the 1960s, Stegner had set to work on his own Western novel, Angle of Repose. It was a project with personal overtones. He knew how easily the past slips away.
I don't know my grandfather's first name. That's how a lot of Westerners get discombobulated from their past.
The story follows its characters across the continent and spans several generations. Their heroine is a Boston-bred artist, Susan Ward. She accompanies her husband, a mining engineer, to the West. But she becomes despondent as the unpleasant realities of frontier life sink in. On one of her trips out west, she reflects on the harsh lives of immigrant families.
She was depressed by the repetitive, ugly, barren little towns across the sod house country. And it could be she felt a shiver of premonition as she described the lonely little clusters of settlers' houses with the great, monotonous waves of land stretching miles around them that make my heart ache for the women who live there.
Inspired by the real West, rather than the West of the cowboy myth, Stegner was able to invest his characters with complexity and intimacy. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Angle of Repose in 1971. By the late 1960s, Stanford had been Stegner's professional home for 25 years. The student rebellion was heating up, and the mood on campus was noisy and contentious. Stegner was coming to a major decision.
I left Stanford, built in some way because of the 60s, not in disgust or anything of the kind, but because I wasn't getting any work done and because it didn't seem that teaching was at the moment a very valid way to spend your time. And I got the feeling, you know, I was into my own 60s, I got the feeling that I didn't have that much time left and I'd better get my work done.
He had watched generations of students pass through the writing program he founded. Their work is found on the shelves of bookstores across the nation. They have written everything from newspaper articles to movie scripts. It was no longer Professor Stegner, but Wallace Stegner, novelist. He found his material in the people and places around him. The suburban middle class he knew best. He and his wife, Mary, lived a quiet life. He rose before dawn and worked daily. He and Mary often hosted writers and musicians. It was the stable life he had hungered for as a child.
How do you make a book that anyone will read out of lives as quiet as these? Where are the things that novelists seize upon and readers expect? Where's the high life? The conspicuous waste, the violence, the kinky sex, the death wish.
Stegner looked beneath the surface of people's lives and discovered unspoken pain and the cures people find. The main character of his 1976 novel, The Spectator Bird, is Joe Alston, an isolated observer of life.
He's always hunted himself in places where he's never been.
He's always been trying to thread some needle with a string that was raveled at both ends. He's always been hungry for some continuity and assurance and sense of belonging, but he never had any ancestors or descendants or place in the world.
In his old age, Joe Alston welcomes his isolation. He declares himself unmoved and unmovable.
Take gratefully any pleasures the world provides, but don't curse God when they fail. The lessons of a life amount not to wisdom, but to scar tissue and callous.
Eventually, life forces Joe Alston to reach outside of himself, connect and grow. It is commitment that saves him and so many of Stegner's characters.
I believe pretty strongly in the virtue of long-term friendship and long-term marriages. I don't think those are things that you can break without leaving yourself kind of Humpty Dumpty. You can't get put back together again. You break something and you can't mend it.
Stegner's fiction incorporates the perspective of old age, and he himself spoke with a sympathy and wisdom which drew people to his readings.
Thank you, Diane. I would love to think you should be believed.
In 1977, Stegner received the National Book Award for his novel, The Spectator Bird.
He is fiercely and fearlessly independent of mind, and not only that, of course, he's a demon writer. Writes like a poet and thinks like a philosopher. I mean, what a wonderful combination.
By the late 1970s, Stegner was again taking on the role of environmental writer. He saw his own politics as a balancing act.
I've tried to maintain what seems to me the more difficult position and ultimately the more American position, which is somewhere, in the middle, probably a little left of center. Which doesn't mean being inert. That's a hell of an equilibristic place to hang out, On that line, you're always falling off on one side or the other.
Anti-federal feeling had again erupted in the West. A movement dubbed the Sagebrush Rebellion called for the sale of public lands. The Reagan administration supported the Sagebrush rebels and launched a market-driven approach to privatize public lands and resources. Stegner was alarmed and began a series of articles and speeches in defense of keeping the public lands public. He drew on his own Western upbringing, recalling years of roaming the West and enjoying its beauty. Most of the freedom of the West, he said, is federally guaranteed freedom. In the inaugural edition of the Washington Post, he asked what sort of vision the Reagan administration had for the American people.
That's the American dream that Mr. Reagan understood, that dream of making it big through personal initiative and so on, and it was seldom done that way. And if it was done through personal initiative, it was invariably crooked. It was like those guys who fought it out in Butte, all of the entrepreneurs who created the Anaconda Copper Company and dominated the history of Montana for 100 years, practically.
The Reagan administration had resurrected the appeal of the cowboy myth. It was an old dream, and Stegner understood the endless appeal.
They always dress it up in language which sounds as if they are holding open American opportunity, but what they're holding open is American opportunity for 2 or 3 people with their hands in the till, 2 or 300, 2 or 300 corporations, probably.
In article after article, Stegner revealed his own dream for the West. A sparsely populated country of ordinary, hard-working people living close to the land.
The West is still nascent, still forming, and that is where much of its excitement comes from. It has a shine on it. This is the native home of hope. When it fully learns that cooperation, not rugged individualism, is the pattern that most characterizes and preserves it, then it will have achieved itself and outlived its origins. Then it has a chance to create a society to match its scenery.
In the 1980s, Stegner's view of the West became a rallying point for younger writers. Terry Tempest Williams was among those who were touched by his words.
Wallace Stegner's gift to me is a poetics of place and a politics of place. And as a writer, you cannot separate the two. And I think when he talks about these lands being the seedbeds for an emerging culture, I see that culture now rising from these sacred lands. I imagine him standing in this red rock country, always with the long view. And I hope that in some way he realizes the community that he has created as a result of his passions.
Into his 80s, Stegner continued an active life, writing and lecturing. He entered the public arena again in 1992 when he felt compelled to reject the National Medal of Arts. He was protesting what he believed was a growing trend of government censorship. The government should support the arts, he wrote, but art must be left to the artists. One more novel lay ahead, Crossing to Safety, rich with the wisdom of old age.
Crossing to Safety comes out when he's, 80 years old. What an incredible thing. You know, most writers burn out long before that, and he's still going. He's got that, that flame that just keeps burning.
Crossing to Safety was intended as a private memoir. It was eventually published despite Stegner's misgivings about its personal nature. His most intimate novel, the story hovers in the twilight between truth and fiction. Crossing to Safety was published in 1987. It achieved the warmth, compassion, and self-irony of Stegner's best work.
I was recently looking again at the opening pages of Crossing to Safety. It's a low-key situation. But what's going on there right at the beginning is the relationship between the husband and the wife. The man is so attentive to his wife, and there's a lot of dignity there, just in a very low-keyed way, honoring each person, honoring the other person's space.
Crossing to Safety is a tribute to friendship, which grows over the years. The story follows two couples through life and reveals how quietly people are sustained and shaped by those around them.
It was about friendship. That's what the book was about. And I wanted to do something which could demonstrate it with all of the strains that often go with it and the amount you swallow sometimes to remain friends with people, or the amount they swallow to remain friends with you, and still the good of hanging on to it.
He looked back over the years, recalling the hardships and the victories.
Whatever happened to the passion we all had to improve ourselves, live up to our potential, leave a mark on the world? Our hottest arguments were always about how we could contribute. We didn't care about the rewards, but we all hoped, in whatever way our capacities permitted, to define and illustrate the worthy life.
To the very end, Stegner was occupied with the conduct of life and the voice of conscience. These were the things that illuminated every book he ever wrote.
Leave a mark on the world. Instead, the world has left marks on us. We got older. We made plenty of mistakes, but we never tripped anybody to gain an advantage or took illegal shortcuts when no judge was around. We have all jogged and panted it out the whole way. I didn't know myself well and still don't.
But I did know, and know now, the few people I loved and trusted.
A few years before his death, Stegner confided to a friend, "My life is not that of a crusader, but that of someone trying to understand where he is, what he belongs to, and what he owes to the land and the society that bred him."
Wallace Stegner, A Writer's Life, is a production of Stephen Fisher Productions and KCET, Los Angeles. Major funding for Wallace Stegner, A Writer's Life, was provided by... Additional funding was provided by... and by... and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
This is PBS.